If you buy a Switch 2 instead of a Steam Deck, you shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. Yeah. How's it going, everyone? As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. This is Deck Ready, my channel all about the Steam Deck. And after the Switch 2 was announced, I was on the Deck Ready Twitter. I had to make a new one. It's at Deck_Ready if you want to follow it. And I saw so many tweets about both the Switch 2 and the Steam Deck. And on both sides of the fence, there was a lot of wrong info. So for today's video, I've collected about 10 or 11 of them, and I'm going to go through and confirm or debunk these tweets. And I got to warn you up front, some of these get crazy. First up, I got an easy one. The Steam Deck is better than the Switch 2. Now, this is something that YouTubers, Twitter people, just people on the streets have been pushing ever since the Steam Deck came out. It's an argument that everyone seemingly wants to have, and there's really no reason for it, because depending on what games you want to play or what hardware speaks to you, it's literally impossible to say one is objectively better than the other. They each have benefits, right? Like the Switch 2 has a 120 hertz screen that's like got HDR, even though it's LCD. It plays first party Nintendo games. It's got the cool mouse controls with the Joy-Cons, and it has a dock that allows it to output to 4K that actually works. But on the other hand, the Steam Deck's got a lot to love as well. Of course, you can take advantage of Steam itself. SteamOS 3 is incredible. You can play pretty much any PC game out there. You can emulate other consoles' games. There's so much you can do possibility-wise with the Steam Deck that makes it a compelling option. But at the end of the day, I'm pretty sure what it's going to come down to is whether or not you care about playing first-party Switch games. If you do, it's worth having a Switch 2. If you don't, it's worth having a Steam Deck. In my opinion, it's worth having both. They both provide benefits, and as someone who really enjoys playing on handhelds, I kind of want both, and I'm probably going to buy a Switch 2. I'm just being real with you guys. So is the Steam Deck better than the Switch 2? I don't think so, but I also don't think the Switch 2 is better than the Steam Deck. If you love the Steam Deck, it's better for you. If you love the Switch and you want a Switch 2, it's probably going to be better for you. And before I move on to the next one, these are not all going to be cop-out answers. That one was just easy to play both sides on. The Steam Deck is cheaper than the Switch 2. In my opinion, this one's objectively true. It's really hard to argue against the fact that the cheapest Steam Deck LCD outside of refurbished, we're talking brand new, is $399. It's gone on sale a couple of times. The Switch 2 isn't even out yet. So objectively, it's just more expensive at $450 or $500 with the bundle with Mario Kart World. Even though the Nintendo Switch comes with 256 gigs on board, they're playing in the big AAA third-party space now, and they have games that when you buy them physically, they come with a cartridge that has nothing on it, and it downloads the game. So like, you're going to need a lot more space than 256 gigs, and the Steam Deck supports any SD card. You can just put any old micro SD in there. It'll probably work just fine. Whereas the Switch only supports micro SD Express, which is like the newest technology, and it's really expensive. Like, you're paying over $100 for a 1 terabyte one, and you can get 1 terabyte regular micro SD cards for like 60 or 70 bucks now. So any way you slice it, the Steam Deck can at its base model and is cheaper than the Nintendo Switch 2. It's really easy to emulate Switch's best games on the Steam Deck. All right, I just got to debunk this one. It is not easy to emulate Switch games on the Steam Deck. I know EmuDeck comes with a Switch emulator, but just the act of getting Switch games is extremely difficult. If you want to dump your own Switch games, which is the ethical way to do it, you either need extra hardware or a jailbroken launch model Switch, which is really hard to come by, especially if you don't want to spend any money. And if you go the more illicit route, I mean, your odds are like 70-30. You're getting a PC killing virus, so it's definitely not worth it. So I don't think it's easy to emulate Switch games on the Steam Deck, and I'm sure they'll be able to figure out how to get a Switch 2 emulator up and running pretty quickly for the Steam Deck, because it's probably built very similarly to the Switch 2 and Switch 1, but it's going to be the same problem where you also have to deal with Nintendo taking down every emulator. You have to deal with not being able to make tutorials on how to do it, because if you show any footage, Nintendo will strike you down. It is not easy. It can be done for sure, and people have done it and are doing it all the time. I even know a few, but it's just not an easy scenario like it is with literally every other console. Like, it's much easier easier to emulate PS3 or 360 games on the Steam Deck than it is to emulate Switch games at this point, because Nintendo is so damn litigious. Steam Deck games are cheaper than Nintendo Switch 2 games. Yeah, this one is definitely true. So the Switch 2 has a weird pricing situation going on where a lot of the first party games are going to be $80, like Mario Kart World, and I'm pretty sure the Tears of the Kingdom Switch 2 edition are $80. But even if you look at the third party games that are also playable on Steam Deck, like Cyberpunk 2077 or Elden Ring, you're paying $70 for those games in 2025 for the Nintendo Switch 2. And you can pay that for those games on Steam, but you'd be a moron to do that, because not only do they go on sale constantly, there are ways to get keys for them from reputable sites for much cheaper, and they just go on sale so much that, like, if you pay the full price, the full MSRP on the Steam Deck, that's insane. You definitely shouldn't pay $70 for either of those games on the Steam Deck. Also, a huge reason a lot of these games are more expensive on the Switch 2 is because people are just willing to pay more for Switch 2 games. They don't get discounted all that often. Like, look at Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, Mario Odyssey, and every other first party Switch game. You might see them drop to like $35-$40 if they're used, but like the most I've ever seen, even Breath of the Wild, a 6 or 7 year old game at this point, go on sale is like $40 or $50, man. Like, the sales do not happen on the Nintendo Switch, and I'm sure companies like CD Projekt Red and From Software are just praying and hoping that there's a market there for these full price games, because they're going to want to keep them that expensive as long as possible. There's also Humble Bundles. There's other bundles on Fanatical. You can get Steam games so dirt cheap that it's not even a competition between whether or not games are more expensive on the Steam Deck or the Nintendo Switch. And even if Nintendo drives up the price of AAA games to $80 for everyone else when they start releasing games after the Switch 2 is out, you will see them go on sale so much faster on Steam than you ever will on the Switch store. And even in the Switch generation, the same games would go on sale for much cheaper on PlayStation 4 than they did on the Nintendo Switch. Like, there is a real Nintendo tax. So are games cheaper on the Steam Deck? Objectively, yes. The Steam Deck can play more Mario Kart games than the Switch 2. Sorry about this one, Nintendo fans, but yeah, the Steam Deck can definitely play more Mario Kart games than the Switch 2, and it can play them really damn well. It's not all doom and gloom though, because at launch, the Switch 2 will have access to 5 different Mario Kart games. You're going to get Super Mario Kart, Mario Kart Super Circuit, Mario Kart 64, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and Mario Kart World. But on the Steam Deck, and I'm going to have to read this off my phone, I apologize, you'll have access to Super Mario Kart, Mario Kart 64, Mario Kart Super Circuit, Mario Kart Double Dash, Mario Kart DS, Mario Kart Wii, Mario Kart 7, and Mario Kart 8. So yeah, the Switch has access to things in newer Mario Kart games like online multiplayer for Mario Kart 8, but that wasn't the statement being made. The statement being made was that the Steam Deck can play more Mario Kart games than the Switch 2, and yeah, you can play every Mario Kart game under the sun except for the mobile one that shut down. So like, you can play more Mario Kart games on the Steam Deck, but you can't play Mario Kart World, which is a big reason I will be buying a Switch 2. I really want to play Mario Kart World. I know they're hiding something with the open world section. It just looks a little too boring. Like, there's clearly going to be some more to the open world element. They just haven't shown it yet, and I'm excited to see it. The Steam Deck has a way worse screen than the Switch 2. Being charitable to the Switch 2, this was in response to that tweet from earlier that was saying that the Steam Deck is $399, so it's worth buying over the Switch 2. And yeah, if you're comparing those versions, the LCD screen in the Steam Deck is objectively than the Switch 2's screen. Not only is it 800p, but the LCD screen in the Steam Deck is regarded as one of the worst LCD screens in a handheld. I didn't think it was that bad, but like, a lot of people agree that it sucks. It also doesn't have HDR, and yeah, I think it's fair to say that the Switch 2's screen is better than the Steam Deck LCD screen. But when you start talking about the OLED, that's up to personal preference for sure, but like, I think the Steam Deck OLED screen is going to be better. It's definitely smaller and it's 800p, but the Switch is not going to be pushing 1080p handheld mode in most games. They're going to rely heavily on DLSS, whereas on the Steam Deck OLED, a lot of games, like the vast majority of the stuff that people are playing every month on the Steam Deck OLED, those support native 800p easy, and I'd rather play native 800p than 1080p upscaled from 720p. That's just me. It's like going to be jaggier on the Switch 2, and the OLED screen is just going to look better than what you'd get out of the LCD screen on the Switch. Switch. I understand that the Switch 2 has HDR, but HDR on an OLED just looks better than what you're going to get out of HDR on an LCD screen. I'm not going to talk so much about the fact that the 1080p screen in the Switch 2 is 120 Hertz, whereas the Steam Deck OLED is 90 Hertz, because there's a tweet coming up about that. So before you comment it, I will talk about that. This one's got a lot wrong in it, and honestly, it really just pissed me off. So I'm going to read you the tweet. It's in response to that $399 Steam Deck tweet, and it says, sigh, ... not 1080p, not 120 Hertz, only digital, no upscaling. I can go on. Like, that's how I read it in my head, and I think that's why it made me so mad, but it's clearly trying to be snarky, and you can't be snarky if you're just wrong. It's not 1080p, that is true, but as we just covered, that's not really the draw of the Nintendo Switch 2, because upscaling is going to be used heavily, and just having an ROG Ally and an Ally X and knowing that the power between the Z1 Extreme is largely similar to what we're going to see in the Switch 2, good luck running most games at 1080p. I just don't see it happening just because of reality. Not 120 Hertz. Now this one's interesting because there is a confirmed game that will run at 120 Hertz, and that is Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. That is a Switch game. It's running at 60 FPS on the original Switch, so clearly because it's so well optimized for the Switch 1, the Switch 2 is not going to have any trouble running it. 120 Hertz will be reachable in that game, and that's cool. But the real draw of the 120 Hertz screen, which Steam Deck people are going to be familiar with, is that it will look good with 40 FPS games. Like Cyberpunk 2077, it's going to run in performance mode at 40 FPS. 40 FPS divides evenly into 120 Hertz, so you're going to get a great frame time graph if you can pull that up, which I doubt, but you'll get great frame times out of the Switch running at 40 FPS. And I'm sure that's what Nintendo was targeting with the 120 Hertz screen. The Steam Deck OLED can change its refresh rate of its screen, which is awesome. It feels like wizard technology. So when you're playing at 40 FPS, your screen either runs at 40 Hertz or 80 Hertz. Regardless, it's divisible. So that's what matters. If you're playing at 30 FPS, it keeps it at 90 Hertz. So it'll look really good. It's refreshing really fast. I think with 60 FPS, it switches to 60 Hertz. The point is that 120 Hertz screen is not for 120 FPS. There are a few games that will support 120 FPS, but it's really for 40 FPS, so it doesn't matter. But the thing in this tweet that really got me going is the part that says no upscaling. That is just so wrong. So like the Switch 2 has DLSS. It's an old version of DLSS that looks good still because DLSS is awesome, but the Steam Deck has built-in FSR that works pretty dang good. It also has access to FSR 3, which looks great. It has access to frame generation with FSR 3.1. You also have TSR from Epic Games, and you get XESS. It doesn't have DLSS, but it has upscaling, and it's had upscaling since day one. I don't know where people are getting this image from, but no, the Steam Deck not only has upscaling, it has many more options and arguably better options than the Switch 2. So that's just wrong. And the tweet got community noted, so that's good. The Steam Deck wiped 256 gigabytes of games off my micro SD card. I'm just calling bullshit on this one, guys. Like the ROG Ally, that had issues with micro SD cards. It was literally frying people's micro SD cards. But me, I've had 4 Steam Decks. I had a launch model 64 gigabyte. I had a launch model 512 gigabyte. I have my limited edition OLED 1 terabyte. And I now have a refurbished 1 terabyte Steam Deck OLED that I'm going to do hardware mods on for videos. I have spent hundreds of hours playing on the Steam Deck over the past 3 years, and I have never once had a game wiped, shaders cleared, or any issue with a micro SD card. And on top of that, I've been using the same micro SD card, the 1 terabyte one I bought in one of the first videos on this channel, across all 4 of those Steam Decks. I've never wiped it, and it works just fine. I switch it between devices, I hot swap it, it's great. I looked up some Reddit threads just to make sure I wasn't crazy, and it brought me back to last year when there was a Steam Deck update that caused an issue with the Steam Deck where your SD card would unmount. So suddenly you'd see like half your games disappear, and then a lot of people went on Reddit and said, oh no, my Steam Deck wiped my micro SD card. I think it fried it because it's not showing up. And then there'd be like a 5 billion upvoted comment that was like, did you try taking it out and putting it back in? And then suddenly the person would be like, oh yeah, it just unmounted. And Valve fixed that issue pretty quickly, so it wasn't an issue for long, but it was scary. It affected me, and I talked about it in a video. So I'm gonna guess that's what happened to this person, but yeah, I couldn't find one credible source that said their Steam Deck's micro SD card got wiped. And on top of that, if that happened, I'm assuming it's because you were using one out of your Switch or like an old micro SD card. But yeah, this is not an issue on the Steam Deck. And if it happened to you, I'm sorry, but I'm very suspect or skeptical or whatever you want to say about this ever happened. If it was an ROG Ally, on the other hand, though, I definitely believe it. The Steam Deck wouldn't exist without the Nintendo Switch. And honestly, I think this one is true in a lot of degrees. So there were handhelds before the Nintendo Switch. We all know this. There was stuff like the Game Boy, the Game Gear, the PSP, the PS Vita, the DS, the 3DS. But the big difference between all of those and the Nintendo Switch is that those games were like made for those handhelds. You had to have a studio making a specific handheld game, and then you had other studios making specific console games for their console counterparts. But the Nintendo Switch kind of changed everything because Nintendo said, okay, we're going to take these 3DS games and upscale them, and we're going to take our console games and make them look and run good on the Switch, and we're going to just put them all on one console. And that is what I think opened the door for things like the Steam Deck to exist, specifically because there were a lot of third-party games coming out like Resident Evil 4, Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen, The Witcher 3, and people were playing them on their Nintendo Switches. Like, people enjoyed buying them enough to buy them for full price on the Switch. So Valve probably looked at that and said, hey, a lot of these people own these games or want to buy them on Steam already. We should make a handheld that can play PC games on the go. And I feel like that's what kind of kicked them into gear on making SteamOS 3.0. So it's not necessarily totally true because Valve has never confirmed it, but I feel like the Switch created a new era of handheld that allowed things like the ROG Ally, like the Legion Go and Legion Go S, and of course the Aya Neo devices and the Steam Deck itself to really exist. I don't think Valve would have come up with the idea to make a handheld that could run all these different Steam games in addition to emulating a lot of them if the Switch didn't kind of put that idea into the mass market as something they wanted. And based on the sales of the Switch, which look like they might edge out and win over the PS2 as the best-selling console ever, I'd say Nintendo had a pretty damn good idea when they decided to kill off their parallel hardware lines and just merge them into one. So when it comes to the idea of the Switch kind of preceding and causing the Steam Deck to exist, I'm going to be charitable and go ahead and say, yeah, I think the Steam Deck does owe the Switch in terms of its existence. Wind Waker on the Switch 2 is worse than Wind Waker on the Steam Deck. This is true because the Switch 2's version of Wind Waker is through the Nintendo Switch Online emulation, so you're emulating the GameCube version. On the Steam Deck, you can not only play that GameCube version, but you can also upscale it and add extra effects. But in addition to that, you can play the Wii U version, which is HD, and it's a complete remake. It looks incredible. I saw one guy bitching about it on Twitter saying like, oh, it looks objectively worse. No, it doesn't. He cherry picked like one screenshot that showed one less shadow than the original GameCube version, and people responded with tons of screenshots where it looks 10 to 1,000 times better. Like, it still looks like Wind Waker as you remembered it, just nicer. It looks better in HD because they did the work to do it right. And as a bonus, the Steam Deck can play Twilight Princess, but the Switch and Switch 2 can't, unless Nintendo ports over the HD version of Twilight Princess or adds it to the GameCube library. That's never going to be the case. So yeah, the Switch is losing in that regard as well. I don't know how expensive copies of Twilight Princess are specifically on GameCube, but if you look at the confirmed games for Nintendo Switch Online GameCube emulation, they basically picked all the ones that are incredibly expensive. They've been pretty smart about that. So I'm sure retro game collectors appreciate that. And the last tweet I have is that the Steam Deck has better battery life than the Switch 2. I think they're equal. I think the Switch 2 is rated for 2 to 6.5 hours. I'm assuming if you're playing Elden Ring, you'll get 2 hours on the Switch 2. If you're playing Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, you'll probably get closer to 6 hours. Same thing goes for the Steam Deck. If you're playing Elden Ring, you're probably going to get close to 2 hours of battery life. If you're playing Hollow Knight or Brotato, I mean, the sky's the limit. I don't even know how long the battery life would last on the Steam Deck with that. I think the real problem is both of them have shitty battery life, and I hope that gets better with future iterations of both pieces of hardware. Thankfully, Valve has said they're not going to do a Steam Deck 2 unless they can keep up with at least the battery life of the original Steam Deck. I'd personally prefer if they exceeded it, and Nintendo proved last gen that they're willing to increase battery life. They put out the Redbox Switch to stop the hardware jailbreaking, but it still had better battery life. I'm pretty sure the Switch Lite, despite being smaller, had better battery life, and then the OLED has amazing battery life. Between all of these devices, the Switch OLED, good battery life on that thing. I've been playing with it to play some Donkey Kong. It's awesome. So yeah, that about brings me to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm assuming you did if you stuck around to the end. Your reward is getting to hear that this dot on my face is from an ingrown hair that I should have listened to my mom. She was like, don't pop them. I popped it. It started bleeding. It turned into a giant scab. So yeah, that's why I've got this scab here on my face. I hope you're having a great week. I hope you had some good food. Some Coke Zero maybe you popped a Zyn while you're playing some games. I don't know. It's the end of the video. So yeah, thanks for watching this one. It was a little different. I'll be back with news later this week. As always, guys, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching and shape on.